Imagine you're in a world with 3 different horses. Horse 1 jumps over a fence. Horse 2 also jumps over the fence. But horse 3 decides she's not going to jump over the fence. In the resulting world state, 2 out of 3 horses have jumped. Now suppose Mary here describes the scenario as follows. Every horse didn't jump over the fence. Did Mary speak correctly or not? This is a truth-value judgment, and given the central role they play in determining the meaning of our sentences, today I'd like to offer you a cautionary tale about interpreting them. These 2 out of 3 scenarios are interesting because adults and kids give very different patterns of responses. Adults readily endorse the utterance, but most kids do not. So what's going on? The sentence is ambiguous, with 2 different interpretations depending on the logical scope of every and negation. Under what's known as the surface interpretation, we say every horse didn't jump over the fence, meaning that none of them did. Under what's known as the inverse interpretation, we say not all of the horses jumped. In this 2 out of 3 scenario, only the inverse interpretation is true. It is the case that not all of the horses jumped. So should we conclude then that only adults are capable of grammatically accessing the inverse interpretation, thereby endorsing the utterance? Well, that's not the end of the story, because in fact we can make kids a lot more adult-like with increasing rates of utterance endorsement. One way to increase endorsement uses what's known as an explicit contrast clause. Now I tell you early on that every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence. And kids' endorsement jumps to 60%. But why? This explicit contrast clause affects our world knowledge. We've learned that horses are pretty good jumpers, so we might expect them to jump over the fence. This explicit contrast clause also affects the conversational goals. Hearing that every horse jumped over the log, we might then want to know not whether any horse jumped over the fence, but whether all of them did. But which of these factors actually causes children to endorse the utterance more? Is it the pragmatic factors of world knowledge and conversational goals, or is the root cause the grammatical access to inverse scope? To tease apart the independent contributions of these factors to the complicated process of language understanding, we're going to need a pretty beefy tool. A computer with which to develop a computational cognitive model of the utterance disambiguation process. Such a model allows us to explicitly manipulate each factor to measure its effect. Our model is conceived within the Rational Speech Act modeling framework, which views language understanding as recursive social reasoning between speakers and listeners. Now, the good news is that modeling this recursive social reasoning is really just a whole bunch of math. But that's also the bad news. For our purposes, we're really just interested in the probability of endorsing the ambiguous every-not utterance in a 2 out of 3 scenario. Here's a look at model predictions. On the y-axis, you have the probability of endorsing the ambiguous utterance. Higher values mean you're more adult-like, lower values mean more childlike. Here's the grammatical factor. How likely I am to access a surface none versus an inverse not all interpretation. Here's the manipulation of world state, moving our expectations from lazy horses to horses that are very good jumpers. And here's the manipulation of conversational goals, changing the goal from deciding whether any horse jumped to whether all of them did. Now what we notice is a much larger effect on endorsement probability from our pragmatic factors than from the grammatical factor of scope access. We see this even more clearly by letting the factors interact. Here the goal is set to whether all the horses succeeded, and I believe that horses are pretty good jumpers. On the x-axis, I'm manipulating grammatical access to scope, which has next to no effect. The pragmatic factors completely overwhelm it. This happens because endorsing the utterance in fact requires no disambiguation at all. Either interpretation, none or not all, completely answers the question of whether all the horses succeeded and informs me that my prior expectations of total horse success do not hold. Our truth value judgments tell us next to nothing about the specific interpretation that adults or children access, but they do tell us about their ability to manage the pragmatic context. And this is where kids differ. So now you have the cautionary tale. Before you can start interpreting truth value judgments, you've got to understand the pragmatics that goes into giving them. And we can accomplish that with just a little bit of math. Thank you very much.